And we are live. This is episode 4 of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson. We've got Seth Law and a special guest tonight, Evan Johnson. And I have a few things to say about Evan. All good. So Evan's worked at Cloudflare. Hold on. Cloudflare. I had got screwed up. The YouTube thing started going, and I have this like weird audio loop. Anyways, so Evan has worked at Cloudflare. Currently works at Segment. Huge into the Go programming language. In fact, just today I was asking him some questions. Let's see, Evan. Anything else you want to talk about with any projects you've got going on? Anything of note happening? Are you speaking anywhere?
No, not really. I just applied to B-Sides SF to do a co-talk with a friend, but that's about it.
Nice. Seth, you've got Hack West coming up in March.
Yeah, Hack West in March. If the CFP is open for B-Sides SF, I may actually push something in that direction, Evan. It'd be fun.
You've got about after this, you're gonna have a very long day because it closes at midnight, I believe.
Closes at midnight? Damn it. That's okay. I can do it.
Yeah, we'll see after a couple more.
Yeah, maybe I'll hold off a little bit on the whiskey then.
Or submit a really awesome abstract.
Yeah, there you go.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's all good.
I guess I'll kick it off with, I don't know, a couple episodes ago, we chatted briefly about cores, cross-origin resource sharing. And, it kind of went off the rails. So we're going to have a more succinct topic discussion about that. I think we've got plenty of things to talk about. A lot of stuff happened this week in terms of acquisitions and just interesting articles and things like that. So, Evan, did you want to? I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but for cores, did you want to kind of delve into that a little bit, or?
Yeah, I can. I don't know who you said you were breaking up for a millisecond, but I'm happy to dive in, talk about it.
Awesome.
Go for it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think last week it was Rob Fuller was in the chat asking about cores and stuff. Wrote a blog post about.
Yeah, I think it was either. Yeah, doesn't matter. Sorry.
Yeah, some time ago. It was it was 2 weeks ago, and he was asking about how cores vulnerabilities worked and what types of vulnerabilities exist. So I did some research about over a year ago now, last February, where I kind of dug into, background of what cores is. Cores is cross-origin resource sharing, and it's a way you can have it in an origin, and an origin is defined as like the full host port scheme. But everything after the slash in a URI is not included in the origin. So any change, like you can be at, for example, I work at Segment, app.segment.com versus .com. Those are two separate origins. And there's special restrictions, same origin policy as it's like the bedrock of all of browser security. So that's something that like most people should be familiar with. So cores is all about poking holes in that. And some of the bugs that I've seen are people just not checking the origin header properly. The big one, I wrote a scanner that's actually available on my GitHub. I'll find out what it's called and post it in the chat right now. But it's I wrote a scanner that basically looked for, that was like domain name.evil.com, where they would respond with all the cores headers that would poke a hole. Basically, I was looking for people who would poke a hole for any origin and like wrote their cores logic wrong. and it ended up being super successful. I scanned the Alexa 1 million, and I found over 700 websites that had done their course improperly. And I ended up looking through, like, why is this the case? And I found a lot of, like, I found Rat cores, the Ruby gem, had implemented this improperly, and there's actually a CVE for it. And I looked, there's actually, like, a lot of people wrote their cores implementation library off of Rat cores. And so I'd send a pull request to them. And I actually, if you're familiar with Caddy server, I sent a pull request to the guy who wrote their cores implementation. And he was like, I just copied Rat cores. I don't know if what you're doing will break my code. And I was like, no, just trust me. Like, just merge this. And it was kind of funny. But yeah, it's kind of a big mess. I'm not sure what specific questions I should talk about, but
yeah, well, I mean, so well, by the way, when we get that link, we'll make sure that it makes its way into this video description for posterity, for those that watch it later.
I had trouble posting links in the chat.
Pass it over to Ken. I think he can post them, right?
Sure.
You know, where we just joined, they don't let you post links. It's their course headers. That's the problem, right?
Oh.
Yeah.
It's their
No,
course headers.
that's interesting. The whole like you talk about the misconfigurations, like the rack implementation or whatever it was, right? Some of the research I've been doing lately involves a company that scans third parties for like public risk profile, right? And one of the pieces of data that they collect is header data. So I've been analyzing it for, okay, like how many, of the million sites that you scan, how many implement, strict transport security or something like that, right? But one of the interesting things that I've seen, I haven't dug into cores that much, but it's on my list. One of the interesting things that I've seen is misspellings of headers, right? So instead of doing access control origin, they leave off like one of the C's in access, and it's multiple sites that do this. It's not just like out of a million sites, you've only got 10,000 or so that are actually implementing something properly, and of those are actually implementing anything, and then of those, you've got 10% that misspell it, or they're like, they're doing something wrong, right? So it's like the misunderstanding that's out there as far as how to implement any of these headers properly is huge, right? It's people don't know what it is that they're really trying to prevent. And so something that, adding a star there is probably, the developers are like, hey, why don't I do this? Because it makes things easier for me, not realizing the full,
There's actually special complexity. So the thing that I always preach with cores is like star is good. It's like, so if you're an external facing site, star is usually good, because if you do access control, allow origin star, you're not allowed to send cookies with it ever. So it auto turns off access control, allow credentials to false. But if you do, so the only problem is if it's like an internal website and you do ACAO star or access control allow origin star, and somebody like inside of a VPN goes to it, then you could like bounce into the corporate VPN using the ACAO star. But cores is crazy. I remembered the concrete question that Rob Fuller had of like, why is it used at all? Like, why is this even a thing? And I kind of agree. I actually think the whole thing needs to be completely rewritten. But I've like tagged Mike West on Twitter a couple times, and it's come up on Web AppSec mailing list, and like it hasn't really gone anywhere. But I think it all needs to be written. But the reason people do it is, the big reason I've found is exactly like the first example I had of like app.segment.com, which is like our actual domain for our actual origin for our website. is at app.segment.com. Like if we went and built a new UI completely from the ground up, we'd probably do it at like appnew.segment.com or something. And to have the two be able to talk to each other is what a lot of developers and engineers want. And then there's also like the complexity of, okay, Disney owns ESPN, and for a long time, ESPN was espn.go.com, and go.com is like Disney's big site. And so if you want communication between espn.go.com and go.com, like that's Cores is the way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the only way to bypass that same origin policy, right?
Yep.
I mean, I guess, yeah, you can kind of understand it from a developer perspective, wanting that ability. But yeah, the whole thing honestly sounds like a bad idea, right? Hey, we're gonna make this very strict policy that protects everyone, except when we turn something on and behind the scenes you don't know about it, so you won't know if somebody's breaking it or not unless your app stops working, right?
Yeah.
So I'm kind of reading your article. So the basic gist is by modifying your origin header, you were able to get them to reflect back that it's cool to share resources with the domain you're requesting from, essentially. Like everything's cool. Which
so
some
examples of websites that were vulnerable to this that I'll just happily share. I believe it's public in my repo I posted. One of the companies that did have this problem that I remember was Angie's List. So I'll use them as an example. And I did on my website, let's just say it was evil.com. I would create a subdomain Angie. It was not Angie's List. It was a different company. Anyways, I would do now it's going to bug me, but I would do
that happens to me, by the way, on every podcast.
Yeah,
stop disparaging Angie's List. Gosh, or we're gonna get all sorts of hate emails.
Sorry, guys. I'm sure I just got you sued.
No, anyways, totally. Yeah, this is awesome. By the way, I'm reading this article and I posted it in I keep interrupting you, but I did post the article that you wrote into our live event, and I'm just reading it. It's awesome. Pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, I didn't actually get a lot of views, and I didn't write the article very well. But one person who read it was I forget his name, James something, over at Portswigger.
James Kettle.
And yep, James Kettle, and he ended up taking it like way further than I did, and like was fuzzing the origin headers. Like he actually wrote and he cited me in the blog post that he wrote about this, and his got a lot of attention, which I like, because whenever bug bounty researchers send his article to me, which is frequently, I can say, hey, I'm actually cited in this article and this is not a bug, and then I just like close it. So it's pretty nice.
It's a nice feedback loop there, right? And no. Well, no, that's like, yeah, that's cool. I mean, sometime later on, right, I'd be interested. Like, I'll dig out the data that I've got from this, risk company, and we may want to compare and contrast. It'd be interesting to do an updated article, and there's a lot of interesting stuff. How many sites did you actually scan? I haven't looked at the article yet, but
so I scanned the full 1 million.
Okay. Just the full 1 million. I'm sure it only took a couple hours, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's Go and multi-threaded. It took a couple minutes.
A couple minutes. Yeah. Okay. So now I have other questions about how you didn't get blocked, and who your ISP was, and I mean that's a real concern doing research nowadays, is just being able to scan that many sites without somebody coming back at you, whether it's your ISP or whoever else.
I actually did it from a DigitalOcean droplet, and I think
Seriously?
they sent me an email where they were like, "Hey, can you stop?" And I was like, "Don't worry, I'm done," and just shut off the droplet.
Yeah, because I've had problems with a little host like that before. I'll spin it up, I start doing something, and 2 hours into it, all of a sudden the machine shut off, and I've been banned, and I have to promise not to do it again before they turn it back on. Well, we noticed scanning activity. I'm like, oh, it's all port 80. Well, yeah. So yeah, it's kind of a
Didn't know I couldn't do that.
huh? Yeah. I'm like, that's the whole reason I have this VM, so you can shut it off and all my other stuff stays up. But
Oh, this is funny. I'm reading this rat cores thread. So on the GitHub page for rat cores and the issue you opened, and it's hilarious because like September 26, 2016, you open this, and then Jen's Void is the username. Links to a blog post on this, which was inspired by James Kettle, which was inspired by yours. So like between September 26, 2016 and then August, it's almost a full year later, it comes back around.
I honestly still think it's an issue that's not getting enough attention, where there's a lot of these libraries that people have used, script or whatever, and they just don't like the underlying like RFC is like so complicated. Nobody actually really the whole thing and understands it, and that like star is different than a reflected origin name, and that subtlety like trips up every implementation I've seen almost. So I think it's still an issue, but I don't know what will happen. I don't know really what to do.
Yeah. So I mean, in that case, what's your recommendation, Evan? Right? You're talking to the guys about throwing out cores. How do you still provide that same functionality without?
Yeah, I don't have a ton of recommendations on how to rewrite the spec. Maybe I would get rid of this star thing in general. Like so the whole reason for star is mostly CDNs with their JavaScript. They want to serve access control allow origin star when they serve their JavaScript. And I think that should just be removed and it should be a separate header. And access control allow credentials should like always be on or something. I'm not sure the details, but I think that part getting stripped out would make it simpler. And JavaScript serve true.
Yeah.
And in case anybody's not familiar with a content distribution network, a CDN, basically it's you can host your assets externally to a CDN. They'll be served fast, quickly. Also, you should get some denial of service protection. And so for you to pull in those assets like scripts or whatever, this is what Evan's referring to with cores, the cores policy.
Actually, CDNs, I mean, I know it's not on our list, but there's that whole Cloudflare, Cloudflare, I guess, or however, whatever you want to call it, that other script that came out as well. I don't know if we want to get into that, though.
Cloudflare de-anonymizing thing.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting. I was running it against a couple hosts, and basically what it does is it compares SSL certificates from mass scans of the internet against the domains that Cloudflare is serving up, and it's like, hey, guess what? This IP, this IP, this IP all have the same domain and the same, right, SSL cert. So maybe you could just hit them directly and bypass Cloudflare completely. So, it's basically allowing, if you really wanted to perform a denial of service attack on somebody, you could potentially do it this way if they are using that same cert.
Yeah, that's been a problem for a long time.
Yeah.
With Cloudflare, and they've always recommended that you use like an IP layer firewall to block everything that's not one of Cloudflare's IPs. specifically the IPs that come from their CDN network.
Yeah.
And they have a new product called Warp that will fix that. Where Warp, you run Warp, and it will only allow you to talk to the Cloudflare network on your web server. And I'm actually not sure about the implementation details of how that works, but it's pretty neat. That's like the final solution for them. But then it does make all their customers like run this binary on all of their servers. So it's not ideal.
Yeah. I mean, but I can understand it, right? Like, you want that protection, you've got to pay for it in more than one way. It can't just be, all right, we're going to route all the traffic that direction and expect to have all the benefit, right? So, but still, it was interesting to see, you know, it's a great use case of all the census data or whatever that's out there as far as, hey, guess what? You're still exposed if you're not thinking about this.
Yep.
Ken, did you play with that at all?
I actually dropped off for a little bit accidentally. I don't know what was going on with my connection, but I think we pissed off Angie's List and they're after me.
Already, that was quick.
I know.
I'm so sorry.
They're pretty elite. Yeah, I don't know. I lost track of where we were at, so nothing to add.
Definitely was not Angie's List, by the way. I feel bad now that I threw Angie's List under the bus, but it definitely wasn't them.
Here, I'll give you the link to that GitHub. You should post that one as well, Ken, while I'm thinking about it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, it's, by the way, I also like the way you titled that issue. Rat cores is fundamentally insecure. Bam.
Yeah.
Love it. Love it, love it, love it.
Putting a little drama in there, aren't we?
Yeah, that was a little.
That's the problem we have.
If you're familiar with Sales.js, I got a security warning for Sales.js.
I'm not.
I don't. It's some JavaScript framework, but I noticed one of the server headers while I was scanning was like server Sales.js. I was like, oh, what's that thing? So I loaded it up, and it has like 13,000 stars on GitHub. So it is somewhat popular, and it had the same cores issue. I've never gotten, this is my first time getting a node security advisory. So it's not a CVE, but hopefully I have many more to come.
Oh, that's awesome. So they took it seriously and were proactive with it and whatnot. So that's awesome. That is very cool. I'm kind of just looking at it right now. A little MVC framework for node.js. Yep. Which is, part of what one of the questions that I figured was, at some point get to tonight, was around like, not necessarily Node.js, but just all the new technologies and how that changes our jobs in terms of testing and looking for security issues, which it does.
Yeah,
it has.
Well, yeah, maybe we want to answer that email now, right? So.
Yeah, and I'm going to say your name. So Brian Gray asked, which was, and that's basically the gist. It was kind of like oh man. So to give historical context to those not familiar, I don't know, 2009, 2010, when you tested an application, it was cool if it had Ajax, right? If it was using Ajax and you're like, wow, this is kind of cutting edge, this is cool stuff. And 2008, 2009, 2010. And the way that you tested a site was mostly, depending on if it was like a classic ASP app or a Java app or whatever, you pretty much had pages you'd visit. It's the web, right? So you had some pages that you'd visit. They would have some forms. You'd fill those out, click around the site. You'd look at the robots.txt And surprisingly, that actually was useful back then. Not to say that, you shouldn't still look at that, but SQL injection was pretty prevalent. In terms of there being things like CSP to prevent XSS, no issues with that. But basically, you had pages that were fairly static in terms of they would load, and what they loaded was what they loaded. And, you click something and you go to another page, and that was all pretty simple. And fast forward to, well, and as time went on, there were things like Flash and Swift files that came along. Silverlight, if you guys remember Silverlight at all. And so things got a little bit more dynamic. There were some, new technologies coming along, but really when we started seeing more heavy use of things like Ajax and JavaScript in general to transform the pages you're testing, where we're at now is we've got a lot of these what we call single page applications. So the front end's built in something like React or Ember or Angular, and that is an MVC framework, like just in the JavaScript that loads on your page or on your when you go to browse the site, it's just a bunch of JavaScript, and it is basically a front end framework. And why they call it a single page app is really what's happening is you're not necessarily loading a bunch of new content to be rendered server side from the server. Once you've made that initial load, what you're doing is you're triggering events by clicking around on the site that then change the local browser's behavior. But ultimately what's happening is there's just calls going off when needed, like RESTful API calls. So you've got basically what I'm saying is most of the front end of the site loads when you initially visit the whatever server. And then from there, based off what you do locally, things change only in your browser, but there's calls going off to a server. In theory, that's supposed to be a really seamless experience. It's supposed to be quick, and what ends up in practice happening is it's just a cluster. Usually, it's just a terrible experience. It's both a heavy browser experience as well as a heavy, in terms of the amount of calls you're making to the server experience. Those types of apps are hard to maintain. And so you've got a whole team dedicated to this, and it still isn't necessarily working right. And I can't say that's always the case, but just from even a usability standpoint is what I'm talking about. So now we've got the security side of that, which is we've got these frameworks that change just the way that we do testing, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I don't know if that's succinct enough, Seth, Evan. That sounds right.
Yeah, it does, right? I mean, if you think back to like the 90s and client server applications, it almost feels like we've moved back to a thick client, right? It just happens to be embedded in the browser, and it's built on JavaScript as opposed to some sort of compiled C application or something that's running as a desktop app. And then it makes calls back to the server, via Ajax calls in the browser as opposed to whatever RPC calls or whatever we did back in the 90s, right? Or even early 2000s, right? With those client server apps. So it makes sense. And it definitely changes the way we test. It has to, right? The same thing has happened with mobile is we've had to come up with new ways to actually analyze those applications, right? I mean, Evan, from your side, as far as segment goes, how do you actually view that when you are engaging the testers from a, hey, we want you to look at our app. How do you ascertain, the differences there from those traditional apps versus what we have now?
My personal opinion is kind of strong when it comes to these. Death smiling while I say this.
You have a strong opinion? What?
Yeah, I think React has done a really good job fixing cross-site scripting. Such a big change. And then I think that ever since Ruby, this notion of fixing SQL injection and it has made huge like leaps and bounds, where now Go has done the same thing with like os.exec and a lot of other functions. I think like injection vulnerabilities are like going away, and a lot of applications now, and I work with developers, I'm just like manually sending curls to their application and like manually checking that like there's no direct object reference issues, and the authentication and authorization stuff works the same. And the issues that I've seen the most is like SSRF, because the world is HTTP now, and people send HTTP requests. That's just like half of every SaaS company's job, is sending HTTP requests on behalf of their customers.
Mm-hmm.
And
authentication and authorization.
Well, for those, if anybody's not familiar with server-side request forgery, essentially let's say in some way the user can manipulate their input so that we'll just use, fuck it, we'll use Angie's List. We were always talking about it. So let's say Angie's List takes input from you, and based off your input, they've got a URL that you give them, and now they're making a request off that URL. Maybe they're fetching a resource. So that's sort of the basic gist of that vuln. Anyways, sorry, continue, please.
I mean that's about it.
Yeah, from a manual perspective, I mean, that when this came up, that was what I wanted to say, is that, hey, guess what? Back in 2010 was like, hey, we ran web inspect, we ran app scan, and we were dependent. We were overly dependent on these dynamic scanners, and there wasn't enough cycles spent on the manual side of things, right? If anything, using a React app or a single page application, it forces me to actually look at the connections that are being made. And I'm more reliant on something like Burp Suite or the proxy, and replaying those attacks to actually manipulate what's going on, rather than just looking at the UI and being dependent on a dynamic scanner. I mean, a lot of those dynamic scanners are having a hard time understanding what's going on with those JavaScript frameworks, and with React and other things. Yeah, with those apps. So
yeah, I mean, the scanners are already had a dubious history with success. Then you throw in this, and that throws off every scanner, right? I mean, every dynamic scanner for single page apps specifically. And I agree with what Evan's saying, because in terms of injection with like Active Record and ORM, and I don't know, we talked about this at one point, but because we were talking about bug bounties and like what if it's not the easy stuff, it's like kind of what you were about to say, Evan, which is stuff like SSRF or authorization related things, which means you have to know the app. But where's I going with that? So injection, yeah, like I can remember actually Dave Ferguson. I remember he's like kind of like, you bastard. He's my very first test with Fishnet, and he was with me, or we were paired up as remote, like completely own this site via SQL injection. And now fast forward, and I agree with Evan. I mean, it's not just Rails. There's a ton of frameworks that are implementing this pattern that just makes it, far more difficult to introduce SQL injections. It's not impossible, but it's far less prevalent in what I've seen.
Frameworks are just getting smarter, where they know that these issues exist, and they want to abstract that away from engineers. And you should be able to create, read, update, and delete your records without having to think about the safety of your parameters that you're passing to your data store. And so I think a lot of people are just like building that in from day one. And I think that's actually attractive, and like helping people get users is like, oh, look, we don't have to think about this security thing. We can just write code again.
Yeah.
And so I think that's like, I think once Ruby came out with like how Ruby, like just there's, I don't know, I think of NoSQL injection in Ruby, but that's probably not the case. I don't actually write Ruby, but I I see that it's very tightly coupled with its model to its data store. People in Gin and Juice know a lot more Ruby than me.
No, Node is in terms of NoSQL injection. I see with Node quite mainly because of the way that the data that's being taken from users is being handled, and if it's passed directly, basically it's easy to take a JSON request, have it as a JSON type, and then pass it to like MongoDB. That's easy to do. It's an easy mistake to make. And Brian Gray made a good point, and he had mentioned Swagger. And if you're not familiar with Swagger, Swagger's just God, I'm going to mess this up. But Swagger is a way to properly document your API endpoints. Is that correct? Is that a fair statement to make? And I think it may have the ability to be tied into Burp now with an extension, so that I don't know if anybody, if you haven't written that, somebody should write, or if it hasn't been written, that somebody should write that. But I'd imagine someone has, where you could parse those endpoints and then figure out, get, delete, put, whatever requests that it needs to go to, which endpoint that needs to go to. Anyway, so he mentioned serialization taking the place of injection. I mean, we've seen it. And speaking of Ruby, specifically like YAML, and we've seen it with just regular marshalling. There's been a couple talks I know in what year is this? 2018. So probably, gosh, was it 2016? I think in 2016 there was an AppSec USA talk on it, on just Java object serialization, deserialization issues. But I've seen it more prevalently. I mean, it's happening.
And I mean, this goes.
Was the talk? Yeah. Sorry, you go, Seth.
No, I was going to say that, everything that we've been talking about as far as these single page applications and kind of the trends that we're seeing. I know OWASP top 10 is on our list. I just taught a course on like the OWASP top 10 and was going through the new version, but that's what we're seeing. Like deserialization volts are on there now. We're also seeing XSS dropped down the list.
Whoa.
So it's still there, but it was number 7 instead of number 3 or whatever it was previously, right? There is some recognition in the community, and you got to give credit to the guys that came in and kind of stepped up for OWASP and redid that late last year, because they did take that into account, kind of what's going on in the community at large and what we're seeing. So there is some relevance that's there. But the deserialization stuff gets to be pretty interesting. I don't know if it's at the level of SQL injection yet, right? I still don't run into it that often personally in the apps that I've been doing, but still a lot of kind of the bread and butter of the industry is those apps that were written in 2010 to 2014, right? That they're trying to update and things like that. So it's not all brand new. It's not the new shiny. So it could be that they exist. Do you, Ken, obviously you've seen them. Evan, have you seen a lot of those, or is that even popped up where you're at?
No. So serialization wise, I think it's like if you're finding serialization bugs, like it better not be JSON. It better be like a binary serialization format like PHP or JavaScript or Java or something. I haven't seen these at all. I think I feel like serialization bugs means nobody should be like serializing arbitrary binary objects. Like you should have like, you should be using cat and proto or something.
Yeah. Well, you're right. Because serialization, when you start talking about like pickle serialization or whatever, like the reduce functions and things like that you can include, that those are dangerous, right? So why are you not just using JSON at that point?
Well, and circling back, circling back to tying in pickle serialization and serialization issues and frameworks protecting developers. Django, I think Django does a pretty good job in terms of focusing on security. And one thing they did, and I don't know, it was like version, I think it's like version 1.6 or something like that. They decided from now on, the default is not pickle deserialization for sessions. And Ruby, gosh, has Ruby followed suit? I think the frame, I don't know. I have to look at Rails. I can't remember off the top of my head. And I work in Rails every day, but the default standard has been use JSON instead of something like Pickle or Marshall, where you're talking about data turning into objects that can execute code. So Django did a pretty good job of that.
Yeah, Brian's asking on chat about how much we actually hunt for it, right? Or if we do. You know, in general, in the bug bounties, I haven't necessarily, right? That's probably where I would be looking for it the most. But again, I'm not running into a lot of apps that are using something that looks like serialization or feels like serialization, right? It's your standard JSession ID cookie. And I'm not seeing those objects being passed back and forth. I mean, it's very rare that I even run into something like a JWT, right?
Well, this is why, I mean, for me, you know, I don't know what, basically, again, looping back to the testing methodology and how it's shifted. For me, you know, I don't prefer dynamic tests anymore. I prefer a combo, static and dynamic. And not even dynamic maybe to validate what I'm looking at, of course, but also really helps with testing patching. But I mean, this is when I see those things, when I'm looking inside of code. It's easier to find. And I mean, we could quickly go down the rabbit hole of that whole conversation that's just played out and old, but you know, static versus dynamic. But I mean, I like to have code for that reason. It's just easy to kind of suss those things out versus, you know, here's a URL and some creds. Have at it.
Yep.
Yeah. I wonder if, you know, Brian's got any more questions around that. But, you know, if we go back to the testing methodology discussion, right, I think manual is just becoming more of the norm, at least for, you know, serious security developers, right, or security engineers. Without it, I don't see how you could actually accomplish it and feel like you gave authentication or authorization a fair shake and, you know, turn to a company and say, yeah, you look good, or no, you don't.
I agree. I agree with you.
Evan doesn't, right? You got some strong opinion there.
No, I agree with you guys. It's like, if there's a lot to find out under the hood, like I look at it from a blue team side or like a purple team side, whatever you want to call it. I have no idea what I'm actually doing. Like someone has an API and they want to know if it's secure, and I work with them and I'm interested in making it secure. Want to pound on the API, and like sometimes it's easier to try it and send some curls, and sometimes it's easier to crack open the code and read it. And situation is what is easiest to actually find out if it's secure or not. Yeah. Like I don't really care. I design decisions like avoid binary serialization formats and like all that stuff entirely, and then like actually just figure out, is it secure, is it not, in the least amount of work possible. So I don't have any strong opinions there, actually. Surprising.
Well, I have a strong opinion. You know what pisses me off? What's a real pain in the ass is when like, I mean, let's be honest, it's always been a very manual process with testing, even though you might, you know, have, I mean, Seth, I went with you, I believe, to a school to learn a dynamic scanner for the company we're working for. And I mean, it was pretty important that you ran that, but ultimately it comes down to manual testing. But what's a real pain in the ass is when Brian, what grinds your gears? I'll tell you what grinds my gears. So when and I see this a lot with mobile apps, when they sign the requests, right, so that you can't manipulate them, so that you can't alter them. That is such a pain. I mean, it like, and especially because, you know, you're doing this as someone who's testing like with a limited time frame, and so you get this, you know, APK, or you get the what's the other one, IPA, whatever it is, and you're supposed to go and you're supposed to do this. And then you get this whole signed request nonsense. And so you like end up spending most of your time trying to get a way to have Burp, like with an extension, modify the request so that you can sign each tampered request outbound. Just don't do that to people that are testing your apps. Don't be that person. Turn that stuff off. It's a nightmare.
I mean, that it kind of goes to what the purpose of the test is, right?
Right.
Do you really want some sort of security output from this? You want to assess the security of the application and find out what the threats are? Or do you just want a red team scenario where somebody knows nothing and they're attempting to exploit you, right? It's the old red team perspective that, hey, all we get is a URL and go, right? This is our scope and we get to exploit whatever we want. And I think, most of us come from the more of the defensive side that we've done over the years. And we would rather be able to see the code and give you output that actually increases your security than just give you an exercise that says, all right, you were able to respond and you implemented certificate pinning in your application and then required a later version of iOS. So I can't actually manipulate those requests. So good job, I guess, right?
I remember one test you were doing, Seth, I think it was you that spent like 2 or 3 weeks on Mallory to do a mobile test or some nonsense like that, just because some BS around.
Yeah. I mean, because at the time there was we didn't have hooks into all of the different mobile OSs. And I mean, that was the biggest pain that, hey, I'm going to intercept all the requests and then try to manipulate them. And I have to write regexes and throw them at Mallory. Don't use Mallory. Just don't use Mallory if you don't have to.
If you learn one thing from this podcast, that's it. Don't use Mallory.
That's it. You can just hang up now. It's fine, right?
But yeah.
No, I mean that goes to all the testing of these the modern apps. Whether it is browser or mobile, it's just you've got to give your ProdSec team or whatever you call it the ability to dig in and look and see what's going on. Part of me actually regrets telling all of the mobile developers, hey, implement certificate pinning, right? It does, because I'm like, oh man, now I have to jump through all these hoops just to actually test, or I have to actually ask you for a build where you disable certificate pinning. I mean, yes, I realize it increases the security of that flow, but then on the other hand, it makes it so difficult to test that you've just got to ask for it up front. And I mean, and that's basically what I've started to do. Hey, are you implementing certificate pinning? All right, I'm going to need a build without that, right? Yes, I can play with Android and try and disable that, or I can play with iOS and, SSL kill switch and all that kind of stuff, but it's a mess, right? It's just, it takes time away from the actual assessment of what would actually give you value. So
yeah, it's like, how clever are you to figure this out and then also test our app? And hey, you have, because we didn't want to pay a lot of money, so we reduced scope down to like a week.
Yeah,
have at it. Yeah, you're not gonna get what you pay. You're not getting what you're paying for, not at all. So
I didn't realize we were going to get into iOS kill switch, but hey, there we go. So the rest still kill switch.
We always have
an absolute AppSec, right?
Yeah, we always have a list of things we're talking about, and then it just veers off. And like we were talking before this, before we went live, and like, Evan, we got 10 minutes left. This goes quickly, doesn't it?
Oh yeah,
it's crazy.
Well, let's see. Was there anything else that Brian asked us? I don't know if I think he's been commenting as well. What grinds your gears? All right. Well, that grinds our gears, but that's because we're coming from a testing perspective. Yeah, or my gears at least. Evan, what grinds your gears?
Yeah, what grinds your gears, Evan?
Yeah.
I don't know what grinds my gears. I don't really have much.
Yeah, whatever. Like, no strong opinions. Come on, we follow you on Twitter. We know there's something in there that's just.
Yeah, you see me in Gin and Juice, and I have many opinions, but I guess you have to ask me first, and then.
Well, is there anything specifically going on? And actually, real briefly, I did want to just mention So in terms of, I don't know, somewhat AppSec events, some just interesting things. So Aspect Consulting acquired by Ernst & Young. Evan had mentioned that CoreOS had been acquired by Red Hat, and Gymnasium was acquired by GitLab. So those are kind of the three big acquisitions recently. I don't know if there are any others that you guys know of, but yeah, it was pretty interesting stuff going on. So any other newsworthy things that we can think of?
No, I don't.
Yeah.
No, I don't necessarily think so. I mean, it's interesting. You're seeing the big four accounting firms, they keep picking up people. I'm sure that's what the Aspect acquisition is about, is them getting that talent, right? And probably the client list, but having the talent as well.
I mean, if my inbox, and it's the same for you guys, I know, really probably for anybody that has application security in their title on LinkedIn, if the sheer amount of recruiting spam that you get is any indication, like the talent, it's difficult to find talent out there, apparently. I mean, I think we all know that, but yeah. And so acquiring a company for its talent makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and I mean, people are going to the big four, right? Sorry, go ahead, Evan.
Well, I don't really know what EY is doing in AppSec. Do they do AppSec consulting? I know you guys are from that side of the house.
Yeah,
more than I am.
I mean, I've run into PwC consultants. I've run into Ernst & Young consultants that,
wow.
Big companies are actually going to them that already have that relationship, and they're expanding their practice into they've always done kind of security auditing. So it makes sense that they expand into that space.
I think we have a friend that works over there doing that stuff.
Who does?
ArcMay. Same code.
All right.
In case he doesn't want to be mentioned. But yeah, name in there. But yeah, that's kind of one of the things they did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, coming from the kind of the client side or the commercial side, Evan, I mean, what is your feeling about engaging, third parties to perform this sort of an assessment? I mean, I know you use consulting firms, but what is it that you're looking for when you talk to those guys?
I mean, I guess I'm really looking for technical excellence and expertise. And I think the real challenge from my perspective is I've talked to a lot of big companies who do consulting and they provide that service, and they're just not good. They're just like, I guess, so used to like looking at legacy .NET apps and stuff. It's really hard to find a San Francisco tier consultant where it's like our tech stack is brand new. Like everything is shiny and right out of the box. And I don't think there are many consultants that have that expertise and have that background. And maybe it's like there's not enough companies who do that yet and they haven't seen it, but it feels like I've had had some good luck recently, and like I've worked to find some relationships with consultant firms, luckily through like back channels and stuff in our AppSec group. But besides that, it's been really hard. Like it's like we speak different languages almost. And then I go in and we had one consulting firm who came in and they looked and they wanted to charge us an exorbitant amount of money because they didn't have a security person to look over what this stuff costs. And I was like, holy cow, this company's like trying to take us for a ride. So they do the assessment, we like work out a price, we do some scope reduction, we figure everything out. Even do the bare minimum of what I would have expected them to do. Like, I don't even know if they got our website running. Billed us 20 days for it. And it's like, I don't think they're just set up for this yet, and I don't think I think a lot of people go through training, like Cigital will train you when you join, and a lot of these big companies will train you when you join. They train you on like how to run npm run server or whatever, or like whatever it is.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, I mean, when I think about like the big accounting firms getting into the space, that's kind of what I expect is, hey, we're going to, take some graduates, we're going to teach them this is security, here's a couple of tools, and then we're going to throw them in an app, and whatever the client happens to want, that's what they're going to get. I have had some success with them going against like cloud because they've been trained up by AWS or by Microsoft, right? So they kind of know the ins and outs of that space. But on the tech stack side, I just question whether or not they, that team, if they're giving those consultants the ability to go out and actually learn about something like Elixir or Node or the new shiny that's in San Francisco. So it's just interesting to hear that perspective coming from your side of a dynamic young company that's trying to push the boundaries. But I don't think consulting in general, we don't typically serve that very well because our margins are all on that business that we've been doing for 10 years, right?
Mm-hmm. Ken Toller asked in the chat if I interview consultants first. And I did not interview in this specific horror story, and since I've gone off about it a couple times, but I did not, and I will always interview going forward, I think. But I wonder, like, do any of these companies have anybody who meets my technical bar?
I do feel like a lot of the niche consulting companies, they're getting bought out. They're getting bought out by some conglomerate with a weird name that sounds like something from the Illuminati. Blackstone. But anyway, so in terms of niche consultancies left, I don't know. It's getting few and far between.
Yeah, but there always seems to be new ones that have been created or, are starting, or a couple guys from Ernst & Young or whatever else, decide that they want to push that envelope, right? And so they leave and then start their own thing. So, I think it's just kind of a cycle in the industry is, all these small companies start, the big companies decide, oh crap, we need those people. They buy them out, and then the cycle starts over, right?
Yeah. That's and a lot of the times the goal is to just get bought out. Mm-hmm. That's the business goal, it seems. So, and it's working.
Yep. Yeah, that is
a little unfortunate.
Yeah, at times, right? It's all the cycle, right?
Yeah, and then those good people disperse to somewhere else, and then we always say AppSec's like a very incestuous community, and it's accurate. There's probably a less disgusting way to say that, but it's accurate. We all seem to roll around and end up working with each other, for each other, whatever.
Yep. Well, and that's, any industry, you find the good people that and that you want to work with. And of course, those are the people you're going to hire because, you trust them implicitly to do a good job. And people get added to that list all the time, right? Depending on who you run into at a conference or whatever else. So anyway, we've hit an hour. Do we want to start a new topic, or what do we want to do?
Yeah, it's really up to you, Evan, because you're the guest. So is there anything?
Hey, you guys, I've got another beer I can crack. We can do one more.
Sure. We keep circling around it, but I think we should just go right into the OWASP top 10. I think we should go into it. I think we should talk about this OWASP top 10 thing. I think we should get into it. And to give some history and some context, there were issues put onto, or issues put into a proposed OWASP top 10 because, every few years there's a new OWASP top 10 list that comes out. And there were debates around, there were a few things. One of the big issues were the actual topics being supplied. It was felt that a couple of those topics were, or a couple of those top 10 items were there to favor the RASP companies, right? So there was a lot of pointing fingers and a lot of you're just trying to sell your RASP service, primarily because the contributors owned a RASP company, right? And if you're not familiar with RASP, gosh, it's a runtime application security protection. Is that right? I actually have to Google it. I think that might be it, but basically it's an agent that runs inside of an application, and when an attack's detected, it shuts it down essentially and notifies, it logs that happened. There's a few companies that do that. So that was one of the issues. The other was that really the metrics collection, like in terms of the actual hard data used, was skewed. There's some long articles that are really good around that, kind of showing and Brian Glass had written a bunch of articles, long articles, really in depth. And I say long, what I really mean is in depth. Like he really covered where the metrics flaws were, proposed some items, and he also went a step further, and we should probably have him on at some point. He went a step further and he actually helped OWASP fix this. So like kudos to him. So he didn't just complain or just point out. In fact, he never really complained. He just pointed out some facts, gave some alternatives, and actually worked on the initiative to kind of like fix the OWASP top 10. So those are the two issues. There's a third one that I wanted to bring up that was, it was the debate of, is this a compliance document? Meaning, if you look at like the PCI standards, PCI standards specifically often reference the OWASP top 10 in terms of like training. Do your assessments cover those items, even if not specifically spelled out? It's the items on the OWASP top 10 that are used. Pretty much across the board, compliance can or has pointed to the OWASP top 10. So a document that was more considered an awareness document by the community that built it became inadvertently a compliant, or inadvertently, advertently, I don't know, but it became a compliance document. So those are three things: the compliance versus awareness, the topics themselves, and then, or it was the data that was collected to build these topics sufficient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean that covers what went on, right? And I already talked about it a little bit, the data that actually digging into it now, right? I feel like as someone in the community, I feel a lot better about what the OWASP top 10 represents, and actually going in front of people and training them on it, right? Because it is like, oh, guess what? Yeah, injection, yeah, it's still a problem. It's not a common problem that we see anymore, but it's still fairly critical if you can find it. But that being said, the other items that are on there, the fact that there is, XML entity expansion, right? Hey, guess what? That's probably coming about more and more. And, I have seen that a couple of times in assessments, as opposed to, CSRF. When was the last time we had an issue with CSRF? Everybody uses a framework nowadays. If they don't implement it, it might be on one page, and really the risk is pretty low. So does it warrant being on that list? I know that 10 items is like this magic number that we can teach people about or talk about. But realistically, it has become a compliance list in my perspective, right? And that's where I have a hard time with it in general is, hey, somebody wants OWASP top 10 training rather than security training, right? So,
yeah, I totally agree with that. It becomes a check in the box versus like, okay, let's look at this. Does injection apply to, if Evan was to bring in training, would he want injection to be covered? Would he want cross-site scripting to be covered? I mean, maybe, but what are some other things here? I mean, all of this stuff is, for the most part, this is pretty much the same, to be honest, looking at this list. I mean, insecure deserialization and XXE are new. But, maybe there's some more interesting things, some things that are more applicable specifically to the language and frameworks that you're working with, Evan, I would imagine. So I don't know how applicable.
I'm reading it right now, the OWASP top 10. I've actually...
Oh, sorry.
What's up?
No, I was going to say, you mentioned like authentication's tested it, pretty good there. Not a huge concern.
Yeah, I think broken authentication, I think, is a real issue. I think like goes too far and talks about like and all that stuff. I think that's important too, but not super critical. I like to look at this. I don't think XXE, like, I don't know, when was the last time? I have not written an application in my life. Actually, that's not true. I have not recently written an application that talks anything XML. So maybe in big enterprises, but sensitive data exposure, huge. Like, I think just data classification is a human problem and not a computer problem. And so I think it deserves to be on the OWASP top 10. Security misconfiguration, sure. XSS, maybe not in today with React. Insecure deserialization, we talked about that. Using components with well-known vulnerabilities. Gymnasium and GitHub are helping me. I don't use Gymnasium, but like you mentioned Gymnasium, lots of these subdependency things. Like people are taking note of what subdependencies they have. And insufficient logging and monitoring, I think, is huge. Not everybody knows how many logins per second their website has and how many authenticated requests per second versus unauthenticated requests per second they have for anomalies and stuff.
From a blue team perspective, that's immensely helpful from an auditing perspective and figuring out what's what. I mean, it's a must. But like, I mean, CORS falls under security misconfiguration, so that could be useful. So I guess it's kind of so like if someone came in and said, hey, this is how you should hash passwords, for broken authentication, would that be useful to you?
If say it again one more time.
If someone came in and said, I'm going to explain the difference between like MD5, bcrypt, etc., like when, what to use, what not to use, how to use it in terms of hashing or encryption, whichever is relevant. Specifically because I'm looking at broken authentication for context. Or would it be more?
This is from a.
Sorry.
You were breaking up a second, so I started talking. This is from like a training perspective, is what you mean?
Yeah. Specifically, like if you're bringing someone for training, what things would you focus on?
I would love for someone to come in and say, like, if you talking about hashing and stuff, if you think this is necessary, like you definitely need to talk to a security person and a product person because this probably wrong path. Like anytime someone needs to roll out cryptography, but I do think like just regular developer, like leveling up our average developer's security posture. I think like the basics of crypto, I think just teaching them security, like this is the CIA triad. This is, I would love to completely ignore the OWASP top 10 and like, this is CIA triad. This is what hashing is. This is encryption and like teach them the building blocks. And I think that'll go further than like arbitrary list people prepared this year for issues.
No, I think that's kind of the point, right? Is like if it's being used, like you have to follow that list in order to meet your compliance goals, and you've got a budget, and you can spend it on, one assessment quarterly, one training yearly, whatever the case is, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of to me, that's concerning. I think by the way, like I just want to say, awesome job to those that maintain and contribute to the OWASP top 10, taking nothing away. But in terms of it being a compliance doc, there's no doubt that's what it's used for. Should it be? Yeah. I don't think so. personally.
Well, and that's where like the fact that I finally did see, right, we're getting more generic in the OWASP top 10, right? Broken authorization or access control, logging and monitoring. I mean, right there we have AAA, right? Authentication, authorization, auditing. Those are the basics. That's the CIA triangle that we're starting to talk about. It's not so focused on these silos of vulnerabilities, even though those are still scattered throughout there. But as someone who trains and someone who goes out and talks to people about security, it's hard to have a discussion because of the because of the way the OWASP top 10 has been represented to them, right? It's like, oh, you have a web application. This is the stuff you have to worry about, right? Even though it ignores at times pretty critical vulnerabilities for your framework, right? You're not thinking about, maybe mass assignment or something like that doesn't come up because somebody didn't bother to talk about it when they talked about access control or the other vulnerabilities that are there. That becomes an issue, and that's where we fall down, and that's where we have vulnerabilities. I did want to point out that Brian was talking about, Brian Gray on the chat brought up that there was just a vulnerability. Shibboleth SSO was just crushed with DTD issues. Right? So that's those
What
XML.
is DTD?
They are. That's the XML entity expansion stuff.
Oh.
I mean, so it's out there, but I think a lot of those are more kind of web service based, like SOAP based systems, right?
SOAP.
They're still there. I
forgot
mean,
about you, SOAP.
Enterprise still does XML, right? And I think that's where most of that happens.
Get your WSDL on.
Yep.
Yeah, it's true that enterprises are using it.
Well, that doesn't surprise me. So does like stop posting shit to your source, like your keys to source code repositories, does that fall under sensitive data exposure?
I think so.
Generic.
I think also it's like privacy as well. I think that I think that will age well, sensitive data exposure with GDPR coming out in the next couple months.
That's a good point.
Where like on whatever social media website or social programming website, looking at you, you can get like names and such. I don't know if this is a GDPR issue, but like, I don't know, sensitive data exposure will be massive with GDPR coming soon.
Yep.
I'm trying to think of what else, like, because I feel like a lot of the sorry, I'm rambling. I mean,
so Ken's just gonna make sounds now, and then we're just gonna cut it, right? It'll be him just and it'll be over. Right?
I can't read and think at the same time. I'm not that smart, so there you go. Sorry, I'm reading broken access control. That's what's tripping me up here.
Yeah, so broken access control is the combination of what used to be missing function level access control and insecure direct object reference. So basically those authorization issues, they're making in a broader category.
Right, which I think is a really good, I mean, that's kind of why, I mean, that was why I was reading it, was to figure out where authorization, because I feel like authorization is one of the biggest problems that I see time and time again. So A5 broken access control, or broken access control. But I mean, yeah, like I think so. Again, kudos to, because of who was it? It was Brian Glass, Andrew Vanderstock, and
someone.
There's somebody else I'm missing, but they did a lot of. Yeah, there was a bit of drama with that. There was a lot of drama with that. Some people came out and said, "Hey, don't be mean to my RASP friends," and others were like, "No, they're trying to make money. They're trying to make this, because it is a compliance thing, and so well, so it's used as a compliance document. So the argument was because it's used as a compliance document, putting that in there then requires the product to be purchased, which then, lines certain folks' coffers. So that was kind of the drama around that. And I think that those folks that I mentioned, and sorry, I'm not remembering the third person, they came in and kind of took out the drama, if that makes sense. They like shifted it into, all right, we're going to make it about the data. And that was a really smart way to do it. Yeah. Anything else on that topic?
No, I don't think so. Right. Like I said, I'm a fan of how it's evolving. I don't necessarily think it applies as like anybody in the industry, like a compliance list, right? It should be more awareness based, and the fact that it got pushed into compliance is, a bad thing, but we have to deal with it, right? We just have to move on and try to expand it out to something that's greater than just that top 10 list. Anyway. All right.
Cool. Yeah.
If you disagree, send us an email, right? We'll have you on so you can talk about it. And maybe we'll have Evan on as well so you can argue about it with him, right?
I want somebody to just argue with Evan for an hour.
Bring on Chris Gates and we'll talk about remote work.
Yeah, you know what? Hey, while we're there, I mean, screw it. What's in a nutshell? What's your opinion on that? Like, I mean, obviously, it's not a great one, but not saying your opinion isn't great. I'm saying it's not a positive.
I think you just said my opinion isn't great, but that's okay.
Speaking from a remote worker standpoint, sure.
I just think it's really hard for smaller companies. I think Chris Gates specifically, who I argue with a lot about this, and you and Neil, you guys have all worked at bigger companies where roles were more well defined and you had real teams, and like the mystery of what you're going to do at work that day. There's not that much mystery about what you're doing today and what you're doing tomorrow and like what's coming next week. I think I just think it doesn't work when your company is too small and there's a lot of things happening at once and you don't really know what is always happening because you really have to be in the room. And but I do think it works when your company matures into that, like we can say, I want someone to do red team full time and we're going to figure out what their like metrics are for success and their success criteria for their projects for the year, and they can do that remotely. It doesn't matter if they're in the office. I really just think it's a company maturity thing, and I think most companies in San Francisco are not there.
Yeah, I mean,
Google or Facebook or something massive.
If you're talking about a 10, 30, 40 person, well, 40's getting, but if you're talking about like a 10, 20 person company that's kind of scrambling, I will say this, you're right about like a company that's scrambling to make it work and, priority shift pretty quickly and things like that. For, Seth and I we co-owned and managed a consultancy that was distributed, but that was, it had its own challenges for keeping everyone apprised of what was going on. Because things, happen rapidly. But what makes that easy from a consultant, makes it easier from a consultant standpoint is like what you said, is that you've got you have a task, you have an engagement, right? And so you have a deliverable at the end of that engagement, and it's pretty succinct. It's pretty clear cut on what you have to do and when you have to do it by. And then in terms of getting help, you might want someone to like review a report or to you throw something into like, Slack or whatever you're using and get some feedback on, hey, what's this? What do you think of this? That's easy. But like if you're trying to do something where it's like your security team, I imagine if you're a 1, 2, 3 person company, you don't know what's going on that day. Like you're probably responding and trying to shovel in a little. I don't know. You could tell us more, but you're probably trying to get like a small amount of time in that week to like dedicated proactive tasks, but you're probably doing a lot of like what's going on and reactive kind of meetings, or what are we doing next? Or you like, hey, something weird happened and someone's reporting this, and now I got to go off and look at this issue, see if it's an issue, audit, whatever.
Oh, I've worked at now segments around a 200 head count, and still I have, we call it a planning cycle. Every planning cycle I have objectives, but there is generally 7 to 8 other things going on at once that just happen. And at Cloudflare got to be about 550-ish by the time I left. It was things coming up that were unexpected. And so I really think that if I had not been, I would have had no idea. And security just would not have been engaged with these, was engaged in helping on. And so some of that just comes from like being proactive and being willing to throw yourself in that. And I think that's a lot harder when you're remote. I think if you're a smaller company, and even if you're 3 people, like you said, you're just struggling to make it, or 40 people or whatever. It's I think it really comes down to how you plan and how you how things happen there. And I just think that in Silicon Valley, the most successful companies are the ones that like, and that type of people, it's hard to figure out a proper planning cycle and stuff. So I don't know. I'm not against remote work. I think it's great. I just think you really have to be in a situation where you say, okay, this remote worker is going to do X. This remote worker is going to do Y. Yeah. And you,
well, I mean, if the majority of the company is in one spot, if you get like 39 out of 50 people or 45 out of 50 people in one spot, and then you got a few remote people, then yeah, then you're gonna have an issue for sure. Or it could, yeah, I mean, it's going to be a problem potentially, but
maybe the best way to describe it. Oh, sorry, I'm cutting you off.
No. I was just going to say that basically, and I'm guessing my Wi-Fi isn't great tonight, and sorry about that. But what I was just going to kind of say is that we mentioned earlier the talent issue, and like that's always been my biggest argument for it, is that finding talent where you live or where your office is. I mean, is that really the best place? That, I mean, just because they live within a certain proximity, and even if you're willing to, even if you say like, hey, we're willing to pay you more and relocate you, I'm not moving to fucking San Francisco. No offense, Evan, but no fucking thank you. No way am I doing that ever. There's no way. I'm a grown up with adults. Not to say you aren't, a grown up with kids. You know, I got like, I can't. No,
I'm certainly not a grown up. It's okay.
I'm just saying, I have a mortgage. I have a kid. I have my life that I lead, and there's no way that you're going to convince me to go somewhere and ride a bike to work and, all that. So no, thanks. But I don't know.
I think the right way to describe it is like a cultural decision from the company. Like the company is going to say that remote work is important for them and figure out how to make it work company-wide. And I think also if you're going to have a lot of offices, remote work, once you get to a point where you have a lot of offices, remote work is not that different from a remote office.
Yeah.
I think once you double down on that, once you get to that point, then it's time to like really make remote work a feasible thing where like everybody has a task, and like it shouldn't be a problem if somebody wants to be remote anymore. So
it's not an easy thing, and like,
and it's I mean, and honestly, from the remote worker perspective, not everybody's cut out for it, right? Not everybody can dedicate their time. Not everybody can slice it up like they probably should. But it becomes obvious fairly quickly, right? And I've been the first remote worker for an organization before, and man, that sucked, right? Like just not being on the ground, people not scheduling bridges and things like that, right? It's like just to get your work done. I found that I had to go on site, right, every other week just to actually get work done because they weren't set up for it. It took them a good 6 months or whatever to figure out how to support me, not necessarily just like from a technical perspective, but from an organization perspective. They wanted to go that direction, but being the guinea pig is not necessarily a fun thing either.
Yeah.
So I can understand exactly what you're saying. That being said, if you happen to run a company that's all based on selling a product to support remote work,
I knew this was going to come up.
Support remote workers. I'm just saying. I'm not looking at anybody specific. Yeah, but
yeah, I think if your whole company is based around the principle of giving people an ability to chat remotely, it's pretty insane to require you to be in an HQ. Like if your product is at all centered around remote companies, you're insane if you think people want to come work at your office. So
I think Slack just hit that point where they have tons of offices now. I think now it's now that is inexcusable. But for a long time, I think that's like totally reasonable. Like,
well, that's a fair point. I mean, that's why we wanted you on. We wanted somebody else's opinion, someone else's point of view. So we appreciate you giving that.
Well, sweet. Well, guys, we've been going for almost an hour and a half, so I think we'll probably cut it. So,
all right, guys.
Thanks, Evan.
We'll thoughts, Evan?
Oh, sorry.
Thanks for having me.
No, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for coming on, man. It's always good chatting. Next time we'll do it in person somewhere, right?
Definitely.
That'd be good.
Cool. Well, this will just for those that are still watching or those that watch later, we'll keep doing it every Tuesday, weekly. And I actually don't know who next week's guest is or if we have one. There's a list. We have a list of people that want to talk. I haven't scheduled them, so we'll see. Either way, yeah, I like that idea, Evan. Getting the gin and juice folks. So yeah. Anyways, cool. Anything else, Seth?
No, nothing for me. We'll announce next week's lineup once we have it, but we'll be back.
All right. I'm going to stop the broadcast.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Later.
Thanks.